I can't believe he stood me up. Not tonight. Not on Christmas Eve. Anya Selwyn whispered the words into the crystal flute of Prosecco, the bubbles reflecting the lonely, glittering lights of the Grand Duchess ballroom. Her hands trembled. Her eyes burned. She was supposed to be watching a screening of the classic Christmas movie, Starfall over Silver Lake, with Preston, a man whose superficial charm had blinded her to his fundamental cowardice for 6 long months. The empty velvet chair opposite her was a monument to her failure to connect, a physical representation of the hole in her heart. He'd sent a text, a flimsy prefabricated string of emojis and excuses about a sudden client emergency. But the lie was as thin as the tissue of snow outside. She knew the truth. Preston, always seeking the easiest path, had found something better to do, someone less complicated. A crushing wave of self-pity, sharp and cold like the winter wind, washed over her. This was the night of fated love, of destiny's perfect alignment, and she was alone. The scent of spiced mead and pine needles, usually comforting, felt suffocating. A tear, hot and defiant, traced a path down her cheek, landing on the cool marble table. She fought the urge to flee, to run back to her small, silent apartment and lock the door against the world. She would not let his cruelty steal her joy. Not completely. She would stay. She would watch the movie. She would sip her Prosecco. But the pretense was exhausting. Just as the opening credits began to flicker on the grand screen, casting the room in a pale, silvery glow, she finally broke. She reached for her cashmere wrap, ready to admit defeat, ready to accept the humiliating truth that her Christmas movie date was over before it began. Preston's cruelty was a beginning, not an end. But at that moment, it felt like the final, definitive punctuation mark on her life's romantic narrative. Her internal monologue, a weary litany of past disappointments, was suddenly, miraculously interrupted. She didn't see him approach, her vision still blurred by tears, but she felt the change in the atmosphere. A sudden drop in temperature, a subtle increase in the static charge in the air, a scent of midnight frost, and ancient leather that cut through the cloying sweetness of the ballroom. "Excuse me, miss, can we join you? The usher said this table was reserved for 2, but since the weak man didn't come, maybe you could meet us instead." The voice was pure, profound, and utterly without malice, cutting through Anya's dark thoughts like a silver blade. It wasn't the voice of the man who had approached, though. It was the voice of a child. Anya looked up, startled, wiping her cheek quickly. Standing next to her table were 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl, no older than 5. They were strikingly beautiful, with eyes the color of dark emeralds and hair like spun moonlight. They wore matching miniature black velvet coats that somehow looked regal in their simplicity. The girl, who had spoken, Astrid, gripped the hand of the boy, Bronte, who looked at Anya with an unnerving, knowing intensity. Behind them stood the man who had accompanied them, Lysander Veronin. Even in the dimly lit ballroom, the man was breathtakingly, impossibly handsome. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit that spoke of old money and ancient lineage. His features were sharp, aristocratic, and utterly shadowed by an aura of profound loneliness. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without ever seeking it. His eyes, an incredible shade of gold-flecked obsidian, met hers, and Anya felt a peculiar jolt, a physical recognition that went far deeper than simple attraction. He held a flute of dark red liquid that wasn't Prosecco. A countess of the Shadowkin, she realized later, would have recognized the lineage and the power instantly. A Dajjager countess would have bowed. Anya, a simple human woman, just felt the air leave her lungs. Lysander gave her a small, almost self-deprecating smile, a gesture that softened the harsh lines of his jaw. Astrid has a very direct way of analyzing social dynamics. I apologize, he murmured, his voice a low, resonant baritone, like the slow, deep stroke of a cello. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, clearly embarrassed by his daughter's profound observation. It seems we were late finding a seat and they spotted your empty chair. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the empty velvet chair, then back to her eyes, lingering just a moment too long. And may I ask, warmly, may I watch? He gestured to the empty seat. I am professionally trained in vegetable negotiations, so I can promise not to be boring, if you can forgive the intrusion. The gentle humor in his last line was unexpected, a brief, warm flash of light in his shadowed demeanor. The children looked up at her expectantly, their innocent faces filled with a hopeful curiosity. Anya found herself nodding, unable to form a coherent word. Yes, please. The more the merrier, she managed, her voice a reedy whisper. The cool, shockingly steady and firm grip of Lysander's hand was on the back of the empty chair, gently sliding it back for her. Astrid and Bronte immediately climbed onto the banquette beside her, one on each side, settling in with a sigh of contentment as if this was exactly where they were always meant to be. Lysander took the seat opposite her, the one Preston had abandoned, and the entire geometry of the evening shifted. The chair was no longer a monument to failure, but a catalyst for destiny. The sudden warmth of the children pressed against her was intoxicating, a simple human comfort she hadn't realized she was starving for. She looked across the table at Lysander. He met her gaze, his obsidian eyes somehow warmer now, less distant. The movie was playing, but neither of them was truly watching. They are, very insightful, Anya said, a ghost of a smile, touching her lips. Astrid said the weak man didn't come. She's not wrong. Lysander frowned, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his features. He stood you up. Tonight. It wasn't a question. On Christmas Eve, Anya confirmed, a residual wave of hurt briefly clouding her eyes. Lysander leaned forward slightly, his elbow resting on the marble table. Then he is truly a fool. A fool with the perception of a pebble. Some men cannot appreciate the ethereal plane of beauty they are granted access to. The formality of his language, the inclusion of ethereal plane, was a gentle reminder of the difference in their worlds. Yet his sincerity transcended the strangeness. It was a description, a compliment, wrapped in a poetic and deeply felt judgment on Preston's character. Flashback. She remembered Preston, impatient, always checking his phone, complaining about the venue being too dramatic. The contrast was a high-contrast irony in action. The worst moment had become the best moment. The rejection had made space for this extraordinary presence, for these two tiny, profound, shadowing twins. The movie, Starfall over Silver Lake, played on, a backdrop to a conversation that felt increasingly important, increasingly fated. Astrid and Bronte, nestled on either side of Anya, were silent now, their attention seemingly focused on the screen. But every few minutes, one of them would reach out a tiny, cold hand to touch her arm, or thread their fingers through the fringe of her shawl. Sensory description, the cool touch of their skin, shockingly so, but steady and firm, grounded the moment, making the fantasy-adjacent elements feel real. Lysander spoke of his work. He managed a global consultancy firm, though his descriptions of negotiations for land rights and interdimensional transit documentation only vaguely hinted at the true ancient nature of his existence. He was secretly solitary, living for his twins, a man whose power required a level of emotional isolation. Anya, in turn, found herself telling him things she had never told Preston, things she barely admitted to herself. Her lifelong dream of opening a small library tea shop, her fear of being fundamentally unlovable, her belief that she was destined for a life of small, insignificant moments. Every disappointment, she realized, had led her here. "I'm not like you," she finally admitted, after describing her simple, quiet life. "I don't operate on an ethereal plane. I negotiate the best price for vintage teacups." Lysander's smile deepened, a rare and devastatingly beautiful sight. "The world requires both the cosmic and the comfort, Anya. You are the warmth that grounds the shadow. The most powerful magic is the one that convinces you to stay." He spoke her name with a reverence that made her heart pound a fast-paced, rhythmic beat against her ribs. Then came the moment of the innocent, profound child as Oracle. During a pause in the movie, where the screen focused on a lone, flickering candle, Bronte, the quiet twin, turned his startling emerald eyes to her, his gaze unwavering. "Papa says you smell like the beginning of a good story," he stated simply, his small voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of the ballroom. Lysander froze, his wineglass halfway to his lips, his aristocratic features flushed with a color that wasn't entirely a blush. He shot a look of mock-stern exasperation at his son, which included a warm, familiar element of parental self-deprecating response to the chaos. "Bronte, darling, we talked about not translating the metaphor," he chastised gently. "It was meant to be an internal monologue." The entire room, for a fleeting second, seemed to hold its breath. Anya couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, joyful sound that felt foreign and wonderful in her own throat. "I think I prefer the translation," she said, looking straight at Lysander. "What does the beginning of a good story smell like, Lysander?" He put the glass down, his full attention focused entirely on her. His answer was simple, authentic, and utterly crushing in its sincerity. "It smells like rain on dry earth. A promise of life where there was only dust." It was the reveal. The moment the dramatic question was answered, not with a plot twist, but with a sudden, overwhelming emotional connection. They were supposed to cross tonight. Maybe the weak man didn't come so she could meet them instead. Anya found herself describing her childhood, her own quiet struggles with feeling like an outsider, a feeling that she now realized was echoed in the solitary grandeur of Lysander. The emotional short story deepened. She saw the flick of recognition in his golden eyes, the subtle tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. He was listening, truly listening, with a depth of focus she hadn't known existed. He was allowing himself to be vulnerable, and in doing so, he made her feel powerful, emotionally resilient. The dramatic fantasy romance was taking root, not in grand gestures, but in shared, intimate silences. The dialogue was simple, contrasting sharply with the poetic narration that defined their internal worlds. Visual metaphor. The camera lingered on the two children, now asleep, nestled against Anya, light and shadows intertwined, a symbolic visual of her acceptance into his dark, complicated world. Lysander spoke of the burden of immortality, the crushing weight of loneliness that came with outliving everyone you ever loved. "I had resigned myself to a life of simply guiding them," he admitted, looking at his sleeping children with a heartbreaking tenderness. "I thought my own narrative was complete, its final chapter written in isolation." He reached across the table, his cool, long fingers brushing her hand. The rhythmic pacing slowed, a slow burn during the high, emotional moment. The brush of his fingers was a catalyst, a sudden surge of understanding. Anya's heart, which had felt cold and dormant, was now beating a fast, hopeful rhythm. She didn't flinch away from the coolness of his touch, but leaned into it. She realized that the tension she felt now was not fear, but a beautiful high-stakes narrative excitement. She had spent her life negotiating for happiness, and here it was, offered freely, if terrifyingly, by a man whose existence defied all her preconceived notions of reality. The revelation, the core destiny fated love trope, was manifesting not as a thunderbolt, but as a quiet, powerful conviction. "You don't get to decide when your narrative is complete," Anya stated, her voice stronger, carrying a motivational warmth. "That's the beautiful, terrifying thing about life, or in your case, about eternity." Every disappointment had led her here, not to finish her story, but to finally begin it. She gently squeezed his hand, a human touch against the coolness of his skin. This repetition of the key phrase, "every disappointment had led her here," served as a rhetorical pause, a moment of profound recognition. Lysander turned his hand so that his fingers laced with hers, a deeply sentimental connection solidified by the simple, warm gesture. "Anya Selwyn," he murmured, the sound of her name on his tongue a soft vow. "You are the antithesis of my existence, and yet you feel like the missing half of my soul." It was the culmination of the reveal, the acceptance of the fated love. The music cue swelled dramatically, piano and cello, as the camera focused tightly on their clasped hands and the sleeping children. This was the moment of upliftment. The heartbreak of the night's beginning was utterly, definitively redeemed. He looked at the screen where the movie couple was finally irrevocably united under a symbolic starfall. "I came tonight to give my children a little magic, a moment of light," he said. "I didn't expect to find the source of it." The movie ended, the lights in the ballroom slowly coming up. Astrid and Bronte woke, stretching like small, elegant cats. They saw their father and Anya holding hands, and their beautiful emerald eyes simply shone. Astrid immediately, and without warning, hugged Anya, a fierce, tiny embrace that felt like an unbreakable seal on their newfound connection. "She can stay, Papa," she commanded, her voice the ultimate authority. Lysander laughed, a rare full-throated sound that chased away the last vestiges of his earlier isolation. "It seems my fate has been decided by a 5-year-old decree, Anya," he said, standing and pulling his coat on. He helped Anya with her cashmere wrap, his hands lingering on her shoulders. The sensory description, the feel of the rich cashmere, his cool, steady touch, was woven through the final conclusive moments. The resolution was simple, profoundly satisfying, and deeply hopeful. Lysander offered her his arm, his gesture formal, but his eyes intimate. "I have a feeling that my home, which has been little more than a fortress of solitude for 2 centuries, is about to become a place of beautiful, delightful chaos," he said. "Do you think you can negotiate with the vampire king, Miss Selwyn?" Anya smiled, a true, brilliant smile that erased the memory of her earlier tears. The child as oracle had paved the way for the destiny-fate analogies to become reality. "I am professionally trained in vegetable negotiations, remember?" she replied, leaning her head briefly against his arm. The script concluded with a rhetorical framing device, a final motivational lesson for the viewer. And so Anya realized that the man who had abandoned her didn't stop her destiny. He simply cleared the seat for the one who was meant to sit there all along. Sometimes the most devastating rejection is simply the universe making room for the love that was always meant to be. They walked out of the ballroom, the twins holding their hands, a perfect unexpected family unit framed by the falling snow. Their figures were silhouetted against the grand, ornate doors, disappearing into the cold night, but carrying all the warmth of 1,000 Christmases.